Good morning, I'm Linda Ostovitz, and we just concluded one of our Breakfast Bar series meetings this morning, and we've had the pleasure of having Eric Tucker talk to us about buying and selling, I guess is the right terminology, in the hospitality industry. And Eric, like I said during the course of your presentation, you called it high level, and I'm exhausted, that if that's high level, the number of issues that need to be addressed and the details that need to be paid attention to are really amazing.
Yeah, there are a lot of moving pieces when you're dealing with buying and selling either a hotel or a restaurant type of a property.
So certainly one of the takeaways is that you don't do this on your own, and you surround yourself with the right professionals, an attorney who knows what he's doing in this area, and CPAs and maybe brokers, etc. This is not for the faint of heart, it appears.
Well, you get into trouble if you don't, have all of the right expertise at the right points of the process.
Right.
It makes it go a lot smoother if you have that.
So one of the things that you had talked about is the letter of intent, and I believe you talked about certain aspects of that, a lot of aspects of that, I think, as being non-binding, but that there can be aspects of a letter of intent that are binding. And for instance, you mentioned the issue of confidentiality. So how does one, in a letter of intent, articulate binding versus non-binding, or are there certain industry standards for that?
So our typical approach is we want to have it be sort of at the preamble would say this is a non-binding letter of intent except as stated below, and sort of default is the provisions in the LOI would be non-binding. And the point there is to give us some room when we get to the purchase agreement to still maneuver, especially if, as the clients get to better focus on what the transaction is going to be, that they're not locked into what they said in the letter of intent. But then we would want to have a provision that says, notwithstanding the foregoing, the parties agree that they will hold the terms of this letter of intent confidential, won't disclose it to third parties, except for their lawyers, CPAs, advisors. Because the point there is to avoid them from sort of shopping the deal, especially in the very early stages, and especially from a seller perspective, getting the purchase price you're willing to offer something for. You don't want that getting out into the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then it seems like the next sort of big piece of this had to do with something that you refer to as the study period, which sounds like it's the opportunity for the buyer to do his due diligence. That's my terminology, not necessarily the industry terminology. And I was wondering, because one of the things that you mentioned was that sometimes there will be the addressing of an issue of whether or not a potential buyer can talk to employees, for instance. And as you were discussing that, I was wondering whether, assuming that there is a study period statement or requirement that you not talk to employees, and if someone does do that, in that study period scenario, are there liquidated damages, for instance, or damages if one violates a condition like that?
So typically, again, every purchase agreement will be a little different. It's what the parties end up agreeing on. But in sort of what I would call a more typical or standard scenario, your study period defines how long it is, what you can do, and one of those things is how the buyer comes onto the property and investigates. Because you don't necessarily want the buyer walking in and saying, "Oh, I'm here to buy the business," and then the employees find out that way the business is for sale. So if there's a violation, typically so you prohibit them from doing that, but they still walk in and say, "I'm the owner." Mm-hmm. There would be a provision there's a default provision that addresses a buyer default, and so the question would be, is there a cure period, but can you even cure or something like that?
Right.
And then from there typically would be what happens if the default isn't cured, which presumably that one could not be, and then typically that would say there's a deposit which can be seized by a seller as liquidated damages. Now, if they really want to sell the property, they may not end up going to that extreme, but it might give them some leverage to try and get the buyer back into line through the rest of the process. That threat of seizing their deposit.
Because like you say, a circumstance like that, you can't undo it. All you can do is, I guess, economically compensate somebody, or
correct.
That then affects maybe the next step in the process.
Right, and what in my experience with my clients where that typically it's come in, they haven't gone that step of trying to seize a deposit, but instead they've used it as leverage over the seller, over the buyer rather, later in the process, where they'll be less likely to offer some concessions or agreements, because they'll say, well, you chased off my general manager by talking to them early in the process, things like that.
The next thing that you talked about a lot was franchises, and I guess that's because in the hospitality industry, a lot of what is bought and sold, hotels, restaurants, etc., are franchise operations. Is that right? So then that means that a buyer not only has to comply with, I guess, the terms of the contract, between the buyer and the seller, but also has to deal with the franchisor almost as a separate, integral matter. Would that be right?
And that's typically in parallel paths, so that as soon as they sign the contract, then they're going to go and apply and start the franchise process, which is its own separate set of negotiations. Probably isn't the right word, because most franchisors are going to say, this is our franchise agreement, and we have it approved by the FTC, so we're not going to change it. But there are some business terms you can try and negotiate there in terms of royalties, and a large part of it's what's called the property improvement plan, or the PIP, that's required to do work on the property before you take it over. You might negotiate there. But that's its whole separate process, where do you have to hire a management company? Do you have to go through training? What are those costs that a buyer needs to be aware of and ready to deal with in order to purchase a franchise property, which is, it's almost a separate transaction in and of itself that buyers should be aware of, and the costs should be factored in to when they're deciding whether they're going to do this type of a transaction, an acquisition.
So it would seem like then that in the contract to purchase the business, one of the contingencies, I guess, is that you satisfy the franchisor and meet all of their requirements before this deal can come together.
So from the buyer side, if you can get it, you want the deal to be contingent on you being approved for your franchise. From a seller, you probably want the deal also contingent on that, because a seller would face something called liquidated damages if they sell the property and the buyer doesn't continue it under the franchise. Basically, it ceases to be an Outback Steakhouse or a Holiday Inn. The franchisors in those contexts, typically their franchise agreements would have some damages they could charge to the existing franchisee. So a seller wants to make the sale contingent on the franchise transfer being approved. So really both parties are incentivized to have that, assuming they want it, continue it as the franchise. They both really want that as a contingency of closing.
Because the seller also has to satisfy its franchisor that it's selling in compliance with its agreement. It's a lot of moving. So it's almost 3 different contracts in play, and the attorney, in terms of what you do, is kind of the manager of all that. Would that be right? The timing is key.
Absolutely. I view it as part of the value we bring to the equation is keeping the clients on track, and especially for ones that maybe haven't done this a lot, we can bring the benefit of having done this for 10 years and knowing where some of those pitfalls can happen and guiding them through that process. We may be not doing all of the pieces of the actual negotiation, say with the franchisor, but we would know to point them in the right direction of, you need to make sure you're dealing with this up front. You need to bring in your CPA to deal with this allocation issue now. So that's for sure one of the values that our hospitality group here can bring to the table.
And speaking of our hospitality group here, you're new to Offit Kurman, your group, and you bring us a terrific set of skills. So thank you for being here, and welcome to Offit Kurman.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us this morning.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.